Thank you, Mr. Rubin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Green, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the Obama administration's willingness to provide Iran with $400 million in cash on the same day Iran released all but one of the American hostages it held. In subsequent days, the United States delivered an additional $1.3 billion. At issue is whether the payment was proper, whether it was ransom, how Iran used the money, and whether the fact that the payment was made in cash might fuel greater terrorism. I've gone into detail in my written testimony utilizing Iranian sources and Iranian government journals with regard to how Iranian figures perceive the payment, how they might launder it, what their strategy is, and how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps corrupts the Iranian economy. For the sake of brevity, let me summarize. When Secretary of State John Kerry says the $1.7 billion was Iranian money, there's no reason it needed to be paid now. After all, successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, had delayed repayment so as to avoid funding Iranian terrorism. Likewise, if the United States freezes accounts linked to al-Qaeda or Hamas, releasing it and saying it's their money anyway would not be a tenable explanation. Cash payments are highly irregular. The closest precedent was the 1848 treaty ending the Mexican-American War. There is no critical economic need in Iran for which they have used the cash. The White House and State Department might perform intellectual somersaults to avoid calling the payment a ransom, but despite initial denials, the State Department has now acknowledged the linkage between the cash paid and the release of the hostages. We have had repeated diplomatic dialogue over the years, so to say that this is just a confluence of events is absolute nonsense. And Undersecretary of State William Burns, for example, met directly with the Iranians in 2006, I believe it was, Ryan Crocker in 2007, the whole arms for hostages scheme during the Reagan administration, that was at its core about diplomatic dialogue. Regardless, Washington's spin is irrelevant. Iranians perceived the payment to be a ransom and said so. Taking this money back was in return for the release of American spies, a senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general said. Not only has delivery of the millions of dollars been perceived as a ransom, provided an incentive to seize more hostages, and indeed they have been seized, but because the money was delivered in cash, the payment bolstered the strength of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and augmented its ability to finance and conduct terrorism. I should say that reliance on the Iranian defense budget or their line items, it shouldn't be done. They're fictional. Iran's budget is opaque. After the Flatow verdict back in 1999 or 2000, where the judge assigned damages based on the line item for resistance, the line item simply disappeared in subsequent budgets. That didn't mean that the Iranians stopped conducting terrorism. Every time the United States government has offered Iran incentives in the face of terrorism, the Iranian response has been more terrorism and hostage-taking. That was the case with the Reagan-era arms for hostages scheme. It should be no surprise that the Iranians have seized more than a half-dozen Western hostages in the months since. The problem isn't just incentivizing bad behavior. Rather, the problem is that the IRGC continues to dominate the Iranian economy. Allowing the IRGC to have custody of the money is to allow the group to launder cash for its own purposes. Even Iran's justice minister, just a month ago, has said that 50 million bank accounts in Iran are opaque or their ownership unclear. That's a country of 80 million people. 50 million bank accounts, the justice minister in Iran says, are basically bogus. In my written testimony, I also highlight how the IRGC often uses the Tehran Stock Exchange to launder money and play a shell game with companies to evade proliferation and terrorism sanctions. So this is another danger of making the payment in cash. Payment in cash is especially problematic as it hampers the ability of the intelligence community and the Treasury Department to trace it. Remember, the Iranian plot to murder the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. was exposed because the United States was monitoring specific bank accounts. Also remember that a suicide bomb belt can cost as little as $1,500. This hearing may be about Iran, but the issue is broader. What happens in Tehran doesn't stay in Tehran. Exposing U.S. rhetoric about refusal to pay ransom as empty has put a target on every American's back and convinced terrorist leaders and rogue regimes that kidnapping and ransoming pays. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber. You're now recognized.